Welcome back, Peter. Great to have you with us. We were just joking before and how I would introduce Peter, and I decided that the way I'll introduce Peter is that I was living a wonderfully blissful, ignorant life until I reached about age 45 when I met Peter and some of his colleagues in the ecological economics world, and they pulled the rock out from the cave and the light shined in and I've been on the same journey as he has, much longer than I have. But at any rate, I forgive you for that, Peter. I've actually enjoyed this next phase of my life much more than the first phase. So welcome to our dialogues.
Well, thank you.
It is.
Thank you for that. I'm glad that I disturbed you from your.
You disturbed me.
And that it was great to have you join me and others on this journey.
Yeah, it is extraordinary to think about that your entire professional life, which is now longer than mine, has been wrestling with and aware of this issue that we now experience as the polycrisis, or as some call the meta crisis. And you are one of the early people to intuit that and question what was happening, and have literally lived your professional life out working on this problem. And maybe I would just and you have a new book out. The book that introduced me to you was your prior. I believe it's your most recent. No, actually, you wrote a biography on Herman Daly since then, but a book called Managing Without Growth, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the, kind of wake up call books that I read before I met you and Tim Jackson and Herman and Peter Brown, the whole crowd. And anyway, maybe let's just start with your reason to write Escape from Overshoot. And if you can also explain, most people here will know what overshoot means, but just in case there's some folks new to that concept, maybe give us a quick explanation for why a new book and what overshoot means.
Sure, thank you, John. Well, overshoot, in the sense that I'm using it, refers to the predicament that any species can find itself in when it attempts to obtain more from its environment than the environment can support. And so that can apply to any species, and it can apply to any sort of level of geography, from fruit flies in a petri dish to humanity on planet Earth and everything in between. And so overshoot then means, when we apply it to humans, we've exceeded the capacity of the planet to support us on an ongoing basis, sustainably. The reason I wrote the book, or at least the stimulation to write the book, really came from the publishing company that for a long period of time, one of the editors there had been trying to persuade me to write something more accessible than the standard academic fare, which I was used to writing, although I always tried to write in a way that a broader audience could appreciate. And I had just finished that biography of Herman Daly that you mentioned, and I'm retired, so I have time available. And I thought, well, I'll try. I'll try to write such a book, and I hope that I've succeeded. One of the features of the book that's very different from anything else I've written is it's full of illustrations. There are 170 images, graphs, tables, but lots of just images in the book, and a relatively sparse text as these things go. So I wrote in order to get these ideas about overshoot and how economics, done, and according to me properly, can help us escape from overshoot, and to get that out to a public and a broader audience.
Yeah, well, it's a great book that I definitely would recommend as a primer for people where this is new to them, because it is very accessible. I skimmed through it before our call or this conversation, but always learn new nuggets. In particular, I love some of the quotes that you drew on from some of the old timers. So thanks for writing that. I want to jump right in, and maybe while we're on this topic of overshoot, I just want to maybe connect it with this concept that I talk about in my writings and in the course called financial overshoot. And so one of the things that I find important is that we take these ecological concepts and then we think through the ramifications of them, not just for the ecology, but for everything that's connected to it. And I've proposed this idea of financial overshoot, which is essentially that financial asset values have discounted the same exponential growth in them that is the cause of the ecological overshoot. And so if we are to escape from overshoot, we're going to have to need to deal with the reality that we're going to need to readjust in my opinion, we're going to need to readjust literally at a macro scale the financial asset values of every financial asset that there is, because they're all valued based on some growth assumption. And that is a lot to try to get one's head around. It's hard. I don't have an easy answer to how that's possible without creating a financial collapse and triggering an economic collapse in the process. So people think about overshoot as an ecological issue, but they don't then connect the dots well enough. And in fact, Peter, you and Tim were some of the first economists to get interested in the monetary system and the financial system, which shocked me, in my kind of coming out of the closet of my blissful ignorance. It's amazing how few economists actually, prior to the financial crash at least, had studied the impact of the financial system on the real economy.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. I know when I studied economics as a graduate student, money and banking, which is the term we used for finance really, was a course you could decide to take or not. So if you didn't take it, then somehow you didn't deal with money and banking, which sounds very strange when you think about our current economy, modern economy. How could you even contemplate the economy without including finance? And yet that's you're quite right. That's what happened. And I have to say that the book that you mentioned of mine, Managing Without Growth, first edition in 2008, I presented a model of the Canadian economy which had environmental components in a way that was somewhat unusual for economic models. But I made very simplistic assumptions about the financial system and just didn't deal with that. When I got together with Tim Jackson, who you've mentioned, we decided to fix that with a number of other problems with the initial model. But maybe you want to get into that later. But I just wanted to say the following, though, sparked by your comment. Biological systems and the economy have a number of things in common, but one that's very particular is they can both be understood as what we call open systems, which mean they survive, they exist based upon the materials and energy that they take from their respective environments. It supports their structures, which and then the waste are produced, and that has to be disposed of back to the environment. That applies to a biological system, and it applies to an economic system. What most economic models fail to do is to incorporate that perspective into the model. And so that can give the appearance that the economy on its own, as a sort of assumed isolated system, can expand forever. So in my work, in different ways, I've tried to bring in these material and energy flows, try to do it in a way that follows what the physicists tell us has to be true, laws of conservation of matter and energy, and then entropy, so things get degraded, and then say, okay, now what does that mean for our understanding of the economy? Can an economy be too big in terms of its environment? Oh, yes, it can.
Turns out they can.
And so how do we escape from that predicament? Is there some reasonable route out? In your own comment was about the potential for a financial collapse. I just want to say how important it was to me meeting you to be able to speak to somebody who had an intimate knowledge and understanding of the financial system, something which I definitely lacked, and was showing an interest in this. And so there's been really quite a coming together of
one banker on the planet that cares about this stuff.
Well, yeah, well, don't depress us.
There's more of us now.
In this conversation. Well, you say that, but I've got to say that in my book, I report some of your work on finance, and I think it's forget 10 steps to stabilizing the financial system. So
Yeah.
in case the audience took to heart from an expert in finance that we're heading for some horrible crash, you yourself have laid out at least a credible path to avoid that. But the changes are dramatic.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that. I want to jump into one of the concepts you've developed, and I think for people that are not familiar with Peter's work, and I'm not saying this just because he's here and I have to say something nice, but Peter has always struck me as a an extremely thoughtful and rigorous analyst of complex issues. And too often people throw out ideas and words and sort of brush over complexities without really thinking them through. And it's actually a skill that Herman Daly had as well, is to really think through carefully what we're talking about. And I just want to illustrate one of them. Peter sent me a paper. We were somewhere and had a conversation, and he sent me one of the projects he worked on, which is called energy emissions trap. And again, this is linked to an idea that I've been wrestling with, which I call limits to investment. The idea that if there is limits to growth and investment is part of the definition of GNP, then the relationship between consumption and investment and government spending is the quote GNP growth that we need to constrain. And yet the mere thought of talking about limiting capital's ability to invest itself is sort of sacrilege in the world of finance. But Peter, tell us just briefly the energy emissions trap, and then we'll connect it to the bigger issue of limits to investment.
Right. Well, first of all, let me say that this paper was a jointly written paper with a then student of mine, Martin Sears, who's now graduated and is a friend and colleague. So we were discussing.
Does that mean he did all the real work?
He did most of it, yes. I had the idea and he worked it out. That's kind of how it happened. So full credit to Martin, which is why his name comes first, not just alphabetically.
Oh, good. Thank you for that.
So the idea of the energy emissions trap is that the concern, well, first of all, I want to introduce a concept called the energy return on energy invested. For any energy system, whether it's fossil fuel, renewables, nuclear, you have to use some energy to get energy out of that system. And the energy out divided by the energy in is called the energy return on investment, or energy investment. It varies sometimes. And
so in other words, the power it takes to drill a hole in the ground and get oil out of the ground.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you go back to
the energy in is the power it takes to drill the hole.
Days, yes, and build the pipelines and everything else that goes into get your energy that you can then use, consumers can use.
Run the processing plant, get it to the gas station. Yeah.
So in the early days, the energy return on energy invested in oil was very large, somewhere in the range of 50 to 1, maybe even 100 to 1, some people say. In other words, you put 1 unit of energy in, taking account of everything we said, you get 100 units out or 50 units out. The energy return on energy invested for renewables tends to be much lower than that. Maybe, well, there's a lot of debate about it, but if it's in the range of 10 or less, then you enter a situation where you require so much energy just to get your hands on energy you can use that you have to invest a great deal, which is where your interest in investment comes in, to get energy that we can use. And so if we go very fast into the energy transition, you absorb so much of the investment available in an economy that is so little for anything else. The rate of growth comes down, can go negative. So that's one side of the energy trap.
Hang on a second, Peter. You said are you talking about you soak up all the available cash that needs to be invested, or the investment activity soaks up the emissions budget that's available?
No, it's the former. That you end up diverting so much of the resources of the economy into getting hold of energy that the amount, in order to free up some energy that you can use, that
Right.
you've diverted it from other activities, and so the economy
Right.
stops growing. That's if you do it too fast. But if you do it too slowly, then you have too many, their emissions are too high. So
Right.
is there a path that's sort of in between, which avoids the energy side of the problem
Hmm.
and doesn't generate emissions that will get us catastrophic climate change? And
Hmm.
we were able to sort of theoretically identify a path or what paths might look like. But the more time passes and the world doesn't really address really either
Yeah.
aspect of the problem properly and adequately, we're in the energy emissions trap.
Yeah. And I
So,
think
but we
there's
worked it out
another.
theoretically to show that was a real problem that's not being
Yeah.
addressed adequately.
Yeah, and it's to me an example of one of the many details and nuances of this challenge that are always glossed over in the popular press, much less in many of the quote unquote expert analyses that says all we need to do is switch out oil and gas and switch on electricity and everything is going to be fine. There's another dimension to it, though, which is the one I was referring to, which is that the faster you go, well, just going causes emissions. And I mentioned to Peter the other day, we can see the tugs and the ships going out of the local harbor, installing a massive wind project off of the east coast of Massachusetts. And I can see the smoke coming out of the smokestacks
Mm.
to install the wind towers. And of course, those wind towers were manufactured in Europe and then stuck on a boat and shipped over to the East Coast before they went back out to be installed. And whatever they do to install them takes energy. And so the faster we do the transition, the more emissions we create to do the transition, as well as the more money we take to invest in it. So um, it's a conundrum, to say the
Well, that's
least.
certainly true in the shortish term. And the other point to make, and I'm a great supporter of renewables. I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression, but it's the energy coming from the sun that's free. The materials that we require to put into solar panels, wind turbines, or any other energy technology you think of, there's always a material component. The material component of the sort of the most popular renewables is so much greater than it is with fossil fuels, excluding the fossil fuels themselves, of course.
Yeah,
Um, so when we model the switch or the transition to an economy based upon renewables, the requirement for materials skyrockets. And we're
yeah,
already seeing concern about lithium and lithium shortages or the human cost of getting lithium, depending upon where you're getting it from, because the amount we're requiring, we collectively speaking, is so much greater than it was before and so on. So
yeah,
there's a mess of problems, which is why I think part of the escape from overshoot has to be a deliberate attempt to reduce the material requirements and energy requirements of our economic system.
yeah,
And then the question is, can we do that in a way that's just, that doesn't penalize already impoverished people, and in a way that helps the rest of us maintain and maybe even get a better sense of well-being. And I know all the interest
yeah,
in well-being, in happiness, is all directed in that sort of direction. And so I'm very encouraged by that.
yeah, yeah. Um, I'm going to jump ahead. We could talk much more about renewable energy. I maybe one last comment. One of the areas that I've found extremely hopeful, and I hope we make progress on it, is this ultra deep geothermal, which would be a beautiful use of the geologist expertise that exists in the oil and gas industry. I know the technology isn't there yet, but imagine if we can get good at accessing that heat that's way down below the entire planet. This whole renewable energy thing we're doing, windmills and solar panels, it would end up being just a bridge to something truly renewable and sustainable, that has none of the adverse consequences. So that's what I'm holding my breath for.
Oh, John, I
Peter,
got to say this. You're taking me back to when I got into this stuff 50 years ago. Then the magical solution was going to be fission and then fusion. And here we are, half a century later, and guess what?
I know.
Well, we've got some fission
Well, the
power.
ultra deep, well, I don't know enough about it to make the
Anyway,
case. From what I've read, it
yeah.
seems feasible and plausible, but we'll see. Let's switch to the big elephant in the room, and you've already segued into it with your last comment about, we need to, at the very least, restrain the use of our material throughput. And it seems to be the thing that's hardest for us to get our heads around. We leap to the idea that we can just change the energy system and keep living the way we're living without having to do any kind of restraint. And I'm reminded of our President Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s with his sweater on in the White House to try to signal to people that, it may be okay that if we turn the thermostat down a little bit and put a sweater on. And here we are, and we ridiculed him and threw him out of office for being, such a stooge. And then, of course, the next president or one after him talked about how the American lifestyle is not up for negotiation or whatever. But we're rapidly facing that reality. In fact, we are in that reality and still haven't faced it. But there's been lots of work done, beginning with yours and others in the 1960s and 1970s about, limits to growth, constraining growth. In my perception, it's become fashionable again, in a sense. There's almost like a next generation of scholars that are promoting this. And with your perspective on it and your, the knowledge that your low growth model that you talked about in your book created for you, I'm just curious, how you're responding to this. It's like around and around we go. We need to stop growing the material throughput, and yet that conversation is not happening at a global level in the institutions that are capable of making a change on the scale we need it. We're talking about renewable energy. We're talking about regenerative agriculture. We're talking about all kinds of good things that are a piece of it, but we seem to be incapable of addressing the elephant in the room, which is the need to shrink the material throughput of the economy. And you've been talking about that for 50 years.
Well, not as vociferously as I talk about it now. 50 years ago, I was interested in how the economy uses materials and energy and where it goes. And then Limits to Growth came out, the book. And by the way, I still have my original copy from 1972.
Really?
The story hasn't changed. But I want to say this. Look, for those of us who are living in North America, we're used to living now in countries of a very large landmass. And particularly in Canada, where we have Canada is bigger than the US, and we're a population of about 40 million. The sense of constraints is way less than where I grew up in Britain, which is an island, or in Europe, where you've got 300-400 million people living on an air landmass. It's smaller than Canada, and there's much more consciousness to limits. They had a conference in the EU Parliament last year called Beyond Growth. And one of the speakers, Dan O'Neill, happens to be Canadian, living in Europe now, spoke about my model and several other simulation models, all looking at how do we make this transition to post-growth. So things never move fast enough. My general observation, but they're moving in the right direction. People are asking the right questions. But I want to make an important point about certainly the modeling work that I've done as I see it. To me, the output of the models is not the data or the numerical the numbers that come out of the model, especially when you're looking 50 years into the future, as we try to do with low grow. The ultimate output is how does it affect your thinking? How does it affect your understanding of the predicament and the opportunities for making change? The actual numbers well, they're just what they are. They reflect certain assumptions that you make. Now, one of the features of low grow is that we try not to assume any more than we have to. So things are generated by the model as much as they are imposed on the model. So the economic growth rate, for example, if we don't assume a growth rate, we don't say, suppose the economy wasn't growing, what would that mean? We say, suppose we invest so much in green energy and other green investments that don't yield a financial benefit, an environmental one, but not a financial one, what would that do to the growth rate? Which is an interesting question. We don't assume it.
Mm-hmm.
So models can be very useful for helping us understand the predicament that we're facing. This is a bit of a side, but I'm going to mention it because I just read a really good book on artificial intelligence. And there, the impression you get is that people want to use artificial intelligence for the output as well. The artificial intelligence will make the decisions about what happens next. That's beyond me. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in using models to inform ourselves about our situation and how we can get out of it, not turning over that responsibility to devices we don't understand.
But what if it's too complex? And I'm just to be clear, I'm not a I'm very concerned about AI for lots of reasons. But one of the intriguing thoughts that I have is that this incredibly complex predicament we find ourselves in is truly difficult to get one's head around. Anyone who's listened to Daniel Schmachtenberger talk about it will realize that, probably collectively everyone on this call, if we all tried to generate the same brain power to figure out the answer, we probably wouldn't do any better than Daniel's brain does. It's incredible. And so there is a challenge of the complexity, which seems to me, if we put the right information into an AI, and that's the key. In fact, I was intrigued, Peter, to learn that your interest in all this work really began with a questioning of the reductionist method itself, as a young scientist. So if we could populate an AI with holistic science and traditional wisdom and living system science, and then turned over some of these hard questions to an AI, rather than have everyone have AI on their phone to do whatever nonsense they feel like doing and burning up energy, maybe AI is showing up just in time to help us escape from Overshoot.
What a Pollyanna-ish view of the future that is. You must have been a
I'm
banker
actually,
one
I mean,
time.
those conversations are happening.
Yes, of course they are. I would still stand by my position. AI can help us, but it has to be us as the recipients who then make the critical decisions. That's the position.
Well, and to that point, I said we need to decide what information to feed the AI to begin with.
Yeah, but it goes searching for all published or all print information. Anything that's on the internet, the AI system search it all. You can't control what it looks at. Anyway, that's a whole other dialogue for you with somebody who really knows that field. But I agree we're dealing with complexity, but I don't think that necessarily means that key components of the solutions aren't in fact quite simple. If we agree that we are extracting too much in the way of resources, particularly biological resources from the planet, and we're putting too much of certain kinds of waste back, then we have some experience through policy to limit those inflows and outflows. That's what environmental policy and natural resource policy, to some degree, has been all the time. In Ontario, where I live, for example, we've put a big green belt around the city of Toronto, around the Greater Toronto area. And when the current provincial government tried to convert some of that to development land, there was an uproar. The government had to back off, even though it had a majority in the parliamentary system, means it can really do pretty much what it likes. As government, there was so much outcry. So we are used to living with limits. The way we regulate access to forests, we take account
Yeah.
of the sustainable flow of timber and so on.
Yeah.
The problem is we don't do it in a comprehensive enough way. So in fact, I'm thinking of just drawing up a list of all the limits I can find in the legislation that we're used to living with, which are always under
Yeah.
challenge from people who see their interests threatened by them. I'm
Yeah.
not an idiot to think otherwise, but I think that the public can understand the concept of self-constraint, self-restraint,
Yeah.
especially in rich countries. So
Yeah.
uh,
I find the
that's my
fisheries,
optimism.
yeah, quotas in fisheries are one that somehow just seem intuitive to people. And we can talk about a quota in a fishery, but we can't talk about a quota for energy. Particularly if it's a quota for energy for billionaires, that seems to be off limits.
Well, it may
Uh,
be off limits in the US, but I don't think it's off limits outside. You've got
yeah.
you've got lots of oil, and you've also got lots of billionaires. So I mean,
Well, you're absolutely right. The ideological challenge, I can't think of any country that it's anywhere close to as difficult it is in the US. Certainly given the scale of the US economy relative to the ideology that we accept. And I don't know. I don't know. That's actually the thing I'm most depressed about is how do we even have the right conversation in this country when we've now politicized something as trivial as ESG reporting, which is nowhere near the solution that we're looking for, and yet we can't have an honest conversation about that, much less something as, I mean, imagine if someone introduced the concept of quotas into the U.S. House of Representatives right now, it just would be laughed at.
yeah.
So
Well, that's why we can't always look to the politicians to be the leaders. If they'd only
absolutely,
be the followers, sometimes that would be helpful. Follow somebody
absolutely.
else apart from the ones with the most money. But we can talk a lot about the issues of outsiders see in the US. Country like Canada is always looking outside its borders for ideas. Now, we often look to the US, and there are issues there. Other countries are much better at learning from one another than we are over here, especially, and if you don't mind me saying, I have a lot of respect for, of course, for the US, but the US and the people I speak to there often don't know what's going on outside.
No,
And so
no,
that's a constraint that needs lifting.
yeah.
See what I mean?
Well, and we get preoccupied with our own, internal dirty laundry. I mean, the only thing you'll find in the news is the nonsense about, the upcoming election and whether we're going to break the budget limit and just stuff that is relatively, um, um, you know, it's unrelated to it. Hey, I want to switch us one last time before we open up the room. At the end of your book, you talk about, I think it's 14, what do you call them?
Propositions. 14
Propositions.
propositions.
And you have a beautiful, here's one of the things I learned I didn't know. There was a book written, I've heard of the book called The Affluent Society back in the late 1950s. And there's by John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the great economists, neoclassical economists. And he in the 1950s was onto the idea of essentially a well-being economy, and that, all of our progress and riches were leaving us camping next to polluted rivers and stuff like that. And you kind of wrote a nice little update for sort of current times. And do you want to read that, or do you want me to read it? I just wanted to share it with folks.
I think I probably got it marked up here.
It's on page
Yeah.
251.
Let me just explain to the audience.
Yeah, maybe a little more context. Yeah.
Well, Galbraith's thesis in the Affluent Society, he was writing about the US now, and the book was published first in 1957, a long time ago. And he observed what he called the contrast between private wealth and public squalor. It was this imbalance in the US then, and I think even more so now, that substantial concentrations of private wealth and all the good things that could buy versus the lack of proper public services, and how the environment was being despoiled as a result of that. And so he writes a little story of a fictional family going for a drive in its wonderful new automobile, and then he describes the horrors that they see as they drive along. And I thought it'd be good to try to rewrite that. Having said I had it marked off, I'm not sure I do. So why don't are you ready to read it, John?
Yeah, I've
Oh,
got it here. It's on page 251 of your book, Peter, if you want to.
oh, I've got it. Okay, so this makes
You'll do a
more
better job at it than I will.
this makes more sense if you've read the original about the car and the billboards and the polluted
It
streets.
works fine. It works good.
Okay, so the, a modern version of what Galbraith had to say would read or could read as follows: the parent rises while it is still dark outside to minimize the morning commute and leaves the children in the care of the foreign nanny whose own children are with their grandmother 3,000 miles away. Ensconced in their self-driving car, they join the daily parade of like vehicles, catch up on work, make video calls, then immerse themselves in a virtual world of sunshine and gorgeous landscapes because the real world they are passing through is made ugly by flashing billboards programmed to display ads based on what artificial intelligence has already gleaned from years of surveillance about the occupants of the cars driving by. Even the views through the window are synthetic, mere image projections on glass. Arriving at their place of work, they leave the car to park itself and enter a building where an individual service vehicle whisks them to a cubicle to spend the day in glorious isolation from any living being, leaving them to wonder if this really is the best of all possible worlds.
It sounds like a Mark Zuckerberg vision of the future of his business strategy in the metaverse.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we can all describe the dystopia that we are
Yeah.
currently moving towards, and we've got to find a way to avoid that.
And maybe I would just interject on if I had to think about sort of how this could play out, I do think, well, put it this way, I don't have the data on this, but I know, and many of them are here today, I know the people that are attracted to our courses are in some kind of a career transition. They've in a sense decided they don't want to be that guy in that car. And I think that could happen, the challenge is that everyone needs a paycheck. And so you stay in that car, you stay that guy in that car until you figure out how to make it work. And I totally get that, obviously. But somehow I think that all of our best efforts at modeling the future and projecting the future, if we've learned anything in the last 20 years and certainly the last 10 years, it's that the future is not going to be what any of us expect. And I think this decision to restrain ourselves is likely to either not come, and that's obviously a very real possibility. But if it does come, it'll come quickly and in a way that we're not anticipating. And it could be as simply as a kind of a mass accelerating decision that people are going to figure out how to make their lives work without being that guy in that car, because it's become so dystopic, if that's the right word, dystopic. And I actually am increasingly hopeful that that's in process. And even people are walking away from well-intended incremental change in shifting the system. And I could name some examples, but even people that are working on the problem and realize that incremental change isn't going to get us there are walking away. And I find it very interesting at this moment. But before we bring people in, Peter, maybe just share a couple nuggets from your 14 propositions as your, at 50 years into this, your key thoughts on how we escape from overshoot, to use your term.
Okay, let me just explain that when I was writing the book and I was nearing the end, I knew I had to say something about how we get out of this mess. And I, like many others, have written lists of policy changes that we could make. I could have done another list like that, but I wanted to try to step back from that a little bit and say, well, what is it we should all try, if we all agreed on, would give us a way forward. So that's what these 14 propositions attempt to do. So the first begin with the agreement that there's compelling evidence that humanity is living in an era of global overshoot. Well, there isn't that general acceptance of evidence, but I think there's a growing acceptance because we're seeing increasing evidence of overshoot, whether the wildfires, all the stuff on climate change, the flooding, frankly, some of the conflicts, military conflicts around the world can be seen as being at least influenced by overshoot because they're land-based. They're people competing over land.
Yeah.
I know it's very hard for me to say which of these I should pick out. Can I send it back to you? And maybe is there one or two that strike
You've got 14 children. You can't pick.
Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, well, we've talked about scale. Um, what is when you say contraction and convergence? What does the convergence mean? And maybe
yeah, I can talk about that. If we're going to reduce the physical scale of the economy, then clearly there are some countries and some people within those countries who are overusing by a long shot what could be sustainable if everybody was to live like them. And so the idea of contraction and convergence is that it's a principle which allows us to go forward where there's some level of material throughput each of us can be responsible for, and energy, I should say as well, that some have to contract to and others can converge to. Those who contract, you're going to have, I'm being included in this, have to use less than we've been used to. And only by that, only if we do that, can the people who are using less than some sort of sustainable level increase what they use to the level that we should all more or less obtain at some point in the future. So it's a sort of a vision that says some have to contract, come down, some can converge, and we should end up in some. It wouldn't be the same for everybody, but within a narrower band than is currently the situation. And this is a principle that's been very well argued for by a philosopher whose name I forget at the moment, but it's in the book. And I thought that was, we've got to have some ethical principle that addresses overshoot and also in its own way addresses the unduly widespread of real incomes and wealth around the world and within countries.
And maybe the last one, I'd jump right to the very last of your proposals and ask you to talk a little bit about political systems. The last one says overshoot will transform economic and political systems. And I think, you have spent your career and I've spent my life since I bumped into you and others like you wrestling with the economic system piece, but the political system piece feels almost harder. And maybe that's sitting here in the United States, but I'm curious what your thoughts are when you talk about transforming the political system.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is a critical question. There are some people who think that we're not going to really make any progress to solving overshoot, or you talked about the poly crisis, until we change the economic system, and the political system, or either or both. Well, that's a view. It's been around as long as I've been around and a lot longer. Unfortunately, I see it as a huge obstacle because it says, well, let's not do anything else because that's kind of a waste of time, postpones Judgment Day. Let's get on with changing the economic system or the political system now. There are others who say, well, we don't need any of that. We can do it all within the system that we've got. So I look at it this way. Our economic system that we have is evolving. It changes, not in a very necessarily completely smooth way, but it's just, any economic history, you can see the phases we've gone through. And the kind of what we now call capitalism is really very different from 19th century capitalism, particularly because of the difference in the role of the state. So we have to and the same thing with our political systems has been changing, continues to change. Uh, so the question to me is, what are the influences on that change? Overshoot is going to be, and already is, beginning to be an influence. So the economic and political systems that we think are somehow, if you're not careful, are fixed and are obstacles to change, are themselves changing. And the better perspective is to say, how do we influence the kind of change? What should we be pushing for? For example, in Canada, we have strict limits on the amount of money that corporations can spend on election campaigns. As far as I
What
know,
a concept.
you have no such limits. It makes a big difference for
I
the
know.
presence of corporations in the election process. That's doable. Um,
Corporations and billionaires. I mean,
yes, same thing.
billionaires are institutions now, and it's crazy. The politicians here all have to go to 10 people for their money to run for. I mean, it's crazy.
So, and that's an example of something that is fixable, and virtually every other country in the world has done it. The US is a bit behind. So what I'm saying is that, in my view, Overshoot will, if we don't take important measures right now, will change our political and economic systems. Unfortunately, in ways that I think we would mostly consider, I would consider very undesirable, further concentration of power, further inequality, and so on. Um, uh, the system we've got will not be the one prevailing in all respects 50 years from now. The change may come a lot sooner. So either we change these systems thoughtfully and deliberately and democratically, preferably, or they will be changed as a result of other factors.
Other forces.
Is a major
Yeah.
one. So that's what that's about.
Yeah.
And I think that's a reasonable proposition that everyone should agree with.
And everyone has a responsibility to participate in.
Absolutely.
I think the last word I'd like to do, just to connect with the escape from overshoot theme, is just to reiterate what folks who are familiar with the regenerative paradigm know is my belief, that if we align our economic system with the patterns and principles of how life actually works, we have, in a sense, the opportunity to unlock the antidote to the entropy physical reality that is the foundation of the entire ecological economics field. And so it's not at all an either or, it's a both and. But I remain hopeful about escaping from overshoot by creating the conditions for health that unlock potential that we can't see today. And whether that's an example of what I just said, people are going to quit their jobs and they're going to work from home instead of commute. I don't know what it is. That's the whole point, is if we create the conditions for health, life has a 2+ billion year track record of surprising us, 4 billion track just on this planet, and 14 billion year track record in this universe of surprising us in magical, wonderful ways. So